Hello, everybody, and welcome to the ABT Time podcast, where it is 3 o'clock in the afternoon in California and in Melbourne, Australia, home of our co-host, Jen. It is what?
8 a.m. Thursday morning. So I'm coming at you from the future. Good morning.
Good morning. And you don't have an ABT Time mug, do you?
No, you haven't sent me one because you're too stingy. I've got a turtle today. Can you see my lovely
I'm sure Liz knows how
turtle?
to take care of that, so we'll get Liz on the job. Welcome, everybody, to today's episode, which is part 2 of what we started very spontaneously on June 9th when we ran the ABT Blitz, the Narrative Blitz event. And it turned out we had so many people and so much to say that day, we couldn't get through all the talks. And I was trying to wrap it up quickly. And Jen jumped in and said, I am not going to let you short shrift the second half of these talks. So we cut it off after the first half, which was the first 10 talks. Today, we're going to go through the second half, which was actually 11 talks. And what we're going to be doing for each one of them is playing the audio of just the ABT. That'll take 15 seconds at the beginning of each one just to reset everybody's memory, what was said there, or for listeners who don't even know what in the world this thing is we're doing. Hopefully that'll orient them. Before we dive into that, a few details on past, present, and future. So past last week, we had what I thought was a tremendous episode, our best episode to date. Do you agree, Jen?
Absolutely. I mean, I guess I'm a bit biased because it's an aspect of the ABT that's so close to my heart, how we teach it, and I learnt so much. But just in terms of the dynamic of us all having a ripper of a conversation, I mean, I think we've said a few times now, Randy, that was our best ever, which is a good sign, right? It just means we keep getting better and better.
What did you learn last week? Give us one highlight.
The thing that really struck me is I need to work out in the subjects where I teach the ABT, because they were fully formed subjects before I attended the ABT course, before I'd started talking with you, before I realized the power of the ABT. So as you do, I retrofitted that into existing subjects that were already very full. And the thing that I'm definitely not nailing yet, or that my team isn't nailing yet, is enough repetition. So I need to do some clear thinking about how to just introduce it more often, even briefly, to the students, so it becomes more of a culture rather than just, here's this one little tool, let's talk about it for an hour or two and then move on. So that was the key takeaway for me.
Yeah. And I think with the repetition, you start to get the results of the repetitions when it really starts to light a fire in you as to why that repetition stuff is so important. Our formula about simplicity plus repetition equals intuition. And I think doing is believing. And I thought we did a really good job of diving into the importance of context and discussing that in a lot of depth, and the case studies between you and Keisha and other people contributing things. The whole session was, I think, it's the best thing, and we'll continue to cite that in the future as people ask. It's a resource. I think it's the best resource we've produced to date. So on that note, let's see, that was last week. Next week, to give everybody a little advanced preview, we're going to have on my old buddy, Dr. Peter Sale, who has just come out with a new book on coral reefs. And Peter Sale is one of the senior statesmen of the whole world of coral reef ecology. He did research long ago, 1970s, in Australia at Heron Island, One Tree Island, on coral reef fish ecology, and published super important papers back then explaining, or coming up with a whole hypothesis to explain why there's so many species of fish on coral reefs and how it is that comes about, called the lottery hypothesis. Over the decades, that's proven to be a super important paper, or a bunch of papers. And this book now is kind of his grand synthesis about coral reefs, and in light of the sad state of affairs today. It opens with a great little anecdote about 1999, the first major coral reef scientist meeting they had, where everybody showed up in shock over the worldwide coral bleaching that had gone on in 98. And that was a turning point. So he does a really good job of telling a story to set up the whole book, what it's about. And we'll dive in deep on that. I'm also going to have a special guest with him, another old buddy, Bob Stenick, who's also a coral reef ecologist at the University of Maine, has done foundational work on marine algae on coral reefs and knows Peter from way back then. So Bob and I had a long discussion last week and mapping out what we're going to talk about in that episode. And then to make sure it's not just 3 old white dudes jawboning about how the good old days were, we will have you there to bring your constant presence of livening things up so we don't get stuck in a rut. So it'll be a great
I'm
episode.
very happy to provide that. And interestingly, the only reason I've been to Heron Island, of all the beautiful places in Australia one can go, the reason I've actually spent time on Heron Island is because when we asked people in the know, obviously my husband and I are both ecologists, we know lots of marine biologists. When we asked people in the know, where should we take our kids so that they can see a coral reef in good health while they still can, because who knows what state it'll be in by the time they're adults, everyone told us you've got to go to Heron Island. So we were fortunate to spend a couple of weeks there a few years ago, just fully immersing ourselves in this beautiful coral reef ecosystem that sadly we know isn't throughout the Great Barrier Reef anymore.
Well, I got to tell you, I spent a bunch of years working in the Caribbean, Jamaica and Puerto Rico and places like that. And then the first place I went in Australia to see the reef was Heron Island. And nobody warned me how cold the water was there. And the first day I jumped in with just a wetsuit top on and decided to snorkel all the way out to the reef crest. And I got halfway out there and was just about in shock. God, that water's cold down there. If you've been raised,
well, it's a long way south.
It just
it's the southern tip.
If you've been raised in the northern hemisphere, it doesn't add up that you could have a coral reef in water that cold. But man, was it cold? Okay. All right. On that note, it's time to get the wheels moving here for today's big event. And let's have everybody just jump in for our discussion. And you know what, each person, as we get going on the comments, I'll ask you to identify yourselves or whatever. The way we're going to do this is we've got 10 talks that were in the Blitz. For everybody who saw the Blitz, either when we did it in mid-April or we did it in early June, you know what this is all about. If you didn't, Matt is going to start each one by playing just the audio of the ABT. We can listen to that 15, 20 seconds. That'll refresh our memory on what it is. One of the people that couldn't join us here, but did a great job of giving written comments on every single one of these presentations, with the exception of the one we added the last time, which is Jose. We'll talk about when we get there. But Patty Limerick couldn't join us, so she had given us her written comments. I will read the one paragraph she wrote for each one. That will also be part of the setup. Then I think we'll go to Mike Strauss, who last time had written comments that we also were using. And then from there, the floor will be open for everybody's thoughts. And we'll just ramble and I'll guide this thing and try and keep us somewhat on track. We'll shoot for about an hour, maybe hour and 15. We'll see what it takes up. But feel free, everybody, to go into whatever topic that you want. And Rick, I hope you're going to join us too. And anybody else that comes along, maybe Park will join us. And on that note, Matt, how about if you play the audio for Michael Bart? Will be our first one.
One quick session. The ABT is an amazingly...
Whoa, can you reset that one?
And you might think...
Okay, taken from the top.
The ABT is an amazingly simple tool. And you might think that you can master it in this one quick session. But you would be wrong. Therefore, I'd like to talk to you about the Dunning-Kruger effect and how it applies to the and, but, therefore framework.
Okay, so that was his setup basically about the Dunning-Kruger. Now I'm going to start by reading this paragraph that Patty Limerick from the World of History had written about his talk. She said, having now said a couple of times that most human beings have never heard of the Dunning-Kruger curve, I will spare everyone another such assertion and instead note that this presentation performs that action I mentioned earlier, reconfirming with variation and distinctiveness the crucial point about the combination of the simplicity and complexity of the practice of the ABT. This piece also delivers a fair warning. While the use of the ABT may seem simple on its face, it's, quote, an art and a skill and requires proportionate effort, attention, and significant investment of time. There's that theme again. So she was mentioning in earlier comments as well, that it will pay off with interest. The appeal of thinking, quote, I've got it now, always asserts a strong pull on the human soul, and operationalizing awareness of the Dunning-Kruger curve offers an effective counterpull. And in an era obsessed with mass, there is added magic in the idea that lemon juice liberally applied to the face will conceal identity. So if you didn't hear his whole little talk, he told about the origin of the Dunning-Kruger curve. Was apparently some guy in the late 90s, a bank robber, who had read that if you write with lemon juice, it will be invisible. And he thought it would work if he squirted on his face, he would be invisible to the video cameras in the bank. And it didn't work for him. So on that note, actually on this one, the second thing we're going to do is, Mike, your comment's pretty short. You want to repeat what you had just real quick for comment?
Yeah, I just have to preface it by saying that in the discussion, he then went on to explain that a lot of academics don't apply the Dunning-Kruger title to that anymore. So my comment was simply, Michael, I don't care what anyone says. I'm going to keep calling it Dunning-Kruger.
Oh, and that's a perfect segue into Liz, who I asked to research a little bit about that comment, because a month ago, I had a conversation with Marianne Geary from University of Waikato. They ran story circles a couple of years ago there. Jade and I went down, ran it with them. And she is psychology professor there. And we were talking about that. And she pointed out that, now there's a lot of pushback and criticism of the Dunning-Kruger curve effect, yada, yada. So on that note, I asked Liz if she would take a few minutes this morning and read up on that. So Liz, you want to jump in and give us what you found out about the pushback on Dunning-Kruger?
Sure. And just so the listeners know, this was an hour ago that I started researching this. Thanks, Randy.
Typical.
So, but I did pull, there was a great, I should give credit to a guy, Gavin Leach on Twitter, who had a great blog post with a whole rundown of some of the stuff that you see in like the replication crisis in psychology, bringing that into it. So I guess the first thing are that there's several claims of Dunning-Kruger, which we already heard. Part of it is that some of the claims weren't really claims from the paper. They sort of resulted from the memes and stuff, like the U-shaped relationship, and the less competent someone is, the more competent.
Okay, wait, hang on. Explain to us what do you mean the U-shaped relationship?
Yeah, like Michael's in his video where you first think you're super great at something when you enter into it. And then as you get into it, you realize, oh, wait, I'm not so great at this after all. And then with more time and effort, expertise, you get a little better at it, and your own estimation of your abilities improve. And I can attest to that doing my PhD right now. And the whole imposter syndrome thing, it's kind of real. And you go into a program thinking, oh, I'm great, I can do a PhD. And then as soon as you get in there, you're like, oh my gosh, what have I done? I don't know anything. Why am I here? So yeah, eventually you get a little bit better about your personal assessment. But just looking through, there's several papers that the blog reference, and there's a Facebook post and some other blogs. A lot of it has to do with statistics. There's one abstract that it speaks to why you want to write good abstracts, because I was trying to pull out the important parts of some of these papers. One of them said, it's concluded that although the phenomenon described by the Dunning-Kruger hypothesis may be to some degree plausible for some skills, the magnitude of the effect may be much smaller than previously reported. That's one of them. The other one I thought I'd read from a different study. Our data show that people's self-assessments of competence in general reflect a genuine competence that they can demonstrate. That finding contradicts the current consensus about the nature of self-assessment. Our results further confirm that experts are more proficient in self-assessing their abilities than novices, and that women in general self-assess more accurately than men. The validity of
that could fill the rest of the hour. Keep going.
There's still more stuff. All right. The validity of interpretations of data depends strongly upon how carefully the researchers consider the numeracy that underlies graphical presentations and conclusions. Our results indicate that carefully measured self-assessments provide valid, measurable, and valuable information about proficiency. So that's the second one. Then one more blurb I'll read, and you guys can all respond to that. The end of this was a Facebook post by Spencer Greenberg, going down. I found the however. I searched for the however, right? However, the results we found are easily explainable for statistical mathematical reasons that have nothing to do with unskilled people being especially irrational, and without making claims like those often made related to Dunning-Kruger, such as, quote, without the self-awareness of metacognition, low ability people cannot objectively evaluate their actual competence or incompetence. There are lessons to be learned in these results, but I think these lessons are more about mathematics and statistics than about the psychology of unskilled people. Okay, how's that?
Wonderful. Anybody want to jump in with a thought on that?
Yeah, Randy, speaking as a representative of half of the population, I can't honestly remember a time that I ever overestimated my ability to learn a new skill.
Which makes me think of the old survey about, what is it, 50% of American males consider themselves in the top 10% for athletic ability. Doesn't quite add up. Jen, surely you've got something to say on the Dunning-Kruger. I mean, I think the divide there is, we got two things. We've got that whole technical body of literature now, all these people that have analytically gone after it. And then, as Michael Bart had said in his talk, there's just the common sense dimension of it. We all know this. We all know that everybody picks things up, thinks they've got it. And I think the simplest dimension of it of all is you figure it out when you start trying to teach it to somebody. That's when you hit that moment of, oh my God, I thought I had this down. I don't know what I'm talking about. Yeah, Jen.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I respect all the literature that wants to argue about the details. No problem. Good on you for arguing about it. But this actually reflects experience. It reflected Michael's experience, and it absolutely reflects my experience, that it's so deceptively simple. I just need to chuck in an and a button, a therefore, and I'm sorted. And I can teach that to students in 20 minutes. But then it's, as Michael said, there's more to this than you think. It's complicated. And I liked his phrase about, wipe the lemon juice off your face and then throw yourself down that curve, and just immerse yourself in reveling in that complexity and realizing that you only do yourself a disservice. Well, and I guess the people you're trying to communicate to, if you imagine that it's simple. And when you immerse yourself in that complexity and understand more about how narrative works, that's where the pleasure for me is, in both communicating and in the teaching form of that. So who cares what we call it, right? Let's all acknowledge that it's deceptively simple.
That's the bottom line. And as a matter of fact, one separate little detail here. Let me quickly introduce everybody who's in this discussion right now. This is all part of our ABT team. So it's Liz Foote in Hawaii. It's Nancy Knowlton in Maine. It's Mike Strauss in Texas. It's Julie Claussen in Illinois. Is that right? That's where you are. It's Marlis Douglas in Arkansas. Is that where you are, Marlis? Nope. Where are you?
Illinois.
Oh, Illinois also. And then Rick Nelson in North Dakota. So I think that's everybody. Shout out if not. Anybody else? Nancy, you got any thoughts on the Dunning-Kruger?
I mean, I think some of the more interesting parts of it are the people who actually get stuck at the top end, which hopefully is not
also known as know-it-alls.
Many of the people in the class, but it's, the whole phenomenon of your actually quite smart uncle at Thanksgiving, notice uncle, not aunt, who it prides himself in his numerical sophistication and refuses to believe in climate change. So these people that kind of get glued to the top of the first part of the Dunning-Kruger curve and never go down to the ones you really have to worry about.
Yeah. The Dunning-Kruger curve is such a powerful and effective little piece of knowledge. It's a shame to have people chiseling away at it for technical reasons when, in fact, people take to it so quickly. And Michael had said, let's just call it the learning bubble effect or some other term. Somebody needs to rename it quickly because it's so valuable practically. We better start moving on, or we're not going to get through all 10 of these. So we already spent 20 minutes here and we're just through number one. We'll get to other folks too. So let's see, Matt, how about the second talk is Park Howell. You want to play his ABT?
When I began using the ABT in my business of story workshops, I became an immediate fan, and it seemed like there could be no downside to it. But then one day I was told in no uncertain terms that it's reductive and insulting. Therefore, I want to share with you my confusion how anyone could be offended by the ABT.
Okay. And then here, let me just jump right in with what Patty had to say. She said, Park Howell, it was an inspired choice to enlist a speaker who radiates good nature as the agent charged with countering the resentment of the ABT as, quote, reductive and insulting. Not that any of the Narrative Blitz speakers are anything but radiant with good nature. Still, having a business guy take on the enterprise of disarming one vocal unit of the not yet loyal opposition is unexpected and thereby inspired and wise. I suppose the subtext here is that academic expertise provides a more nurturing petri dish for the cultivation of the reductive and insulting accusation, thus arranging to have a business communications professor confess this earnest bewilderment. How could anyone be offended? And then concluding with a chorus of declarations of make the world better. That's how his video ended, with that little thing from Silicon Valley, while the guy saying, if we do this, we'll make the world a better place. Adds up to its own reminder that Hollywood's attention to the choice in casting carries its own relevance for the Narrative Blitz. And I was and am happy to see the Gettysburg Address brought into consideration along with the trucking company advertisement though I actually think that the trucking company's awakening may have stolen the show from the address. So that was all from out of his talk there. Mike Strauss, you got a quick thought on Parks?
Yeah, so as I watched Parks, I noticed that over his left shoulder was his piano, and carefully placed on his piano was a copy of his book. So my comment was, doesn't Park owe us something for the product placement on the piano in his video?
We'll have to find out how many copies that sold for him. Let's see, Julie, you said you have just rewatched these videos. You must have fresh thoughts about Park.
Yeah, so the thing that actually hit me rewatching this was not so much the negative message, but you often say there is no such thing as science communication. It's just communication. It's just really about, about the form. And so Park's example of, using the ABT and the power of the ABT in the business world, it just reiterated that it's really not science communication or business communication. It's communication.
And Dianna, I see you've just joined us. Hey, greetings from Friday Harbor.
Yes.
Yay. How nice is it to be back there in the heat?
Well, it's nicer now that our heat wave has broken. It's that record heat.
How bad did it get there at Friday Harbor?
93.
God.
Just
unbelievable.
It's really, really hot for here, and no one has air conditioning.
Yikes. Oh boy.
Let's exciting.
You remember Park's presentation in the Blitz. You got a thought or two, because you've drawn a lot from his participation in the course. So got a couple thoughts on what he had to say?
Well, I think that Julie really, said what needed to be said about it. And he's so upbeat and a good speaker, and people just want to listen to what he has to say. And so I think he was very, very effective at communicating. This is about communication, and it doesn't matter whether you're selling trucks or trying to communicate to the country about a horrible war, or if you're going to talk about science. It's how are you going to be effective at what you communicate? And I think that he did a very good job at that.
All right, I'm going to say something that he'll probably hate me for discussing here, but years ago, I did this thing about 10 years ago called the process communication model. It's sort of a version of Myers-Briggs. It's about personality dynamics, and they break it down to 6 major traits. And one of those 6 traits is promoter. So it's like thinker, dreamer, harmonizer, and promoter is one of them. And then they have all these things that go along with these kind of corresponding traits that go with that dimension of personality. And honest to goodness, in there, it says people that are big promoters are drawn to the color red. And go look at Park's website, his books, all of his materials, and everything about him is the color red. And you got to love the guy. He's a tremendous promoter, as he should be in the business and advertising world. But it's uncanny ever since, when I did that thing, the process communication model, I told them flat out, half of what you're preaching here is noise and garbage, but I swear half of what you are preaching is bullseye. And that was one of the ones that I couldn't believe. Ever since then, I run into these people that are big promoters, and sure enough, they tend to wear red. Although I notice Rick is wearing a red t-shirt right now. So maybe that says something about him.
Randy, that almost sounds like one of those pop psychology things you love so much. So which is it? Is it the cause or the effect?
I swear. There's at least 4 different times I can think of people that I've known that are just heavy promoters. And I've shown up at an event and they're wearing red outfit or something. Oh my God, it's true. And we did it with our Story Circles materials. You may remember I came up with all that. I scored massively on that little test for promoter. Rebel promoter were my 2 traits out of the 6. But anyhow, Rick, you got some thoughts on Park?
You're muted, Rick.
Rick, you're muted. We're not hearing you.
There we go. That would help, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
It's hard to promote. It's hard to promote when you're not on.
When you don't have a voice, right?
The first time that I heard Park, he just blew me away, right? It just, not only is he an upbeat guy, but what he brings to the table is that real world experience and the business folks, you know, and he said this, we're selling stuff, we're out to make a profit. And I think that's the difference between that world and the science folks, where we don't think we have to sell anything for the most part, except to our colleagues and ourselves. And so every time I hear Park talk, I come back to this first time I ever heard him, and he just said it so succinctly and so well that it's kind of the model, I think, for me in terms of thinking about when I talk to my sciencey friends. I don't talk to them like scientists. I talk to them like Park talks to the business people, right? I'm trying to sell them on the concept. And so, you know, my red shirt today has nothing to do with promotion, although, you know, I've been promoting this with my colleagues for a long, long time.
Yeah. Park is really, you know, it's been a 7 or 8 year collaboration I've had with him. And nowadays he speaks the voice of simplicity so articulately, and he tells me anecdotes of groups that he meets with, and he's now really trying to get them to understand the power and importance of simplicity and how everybody wants to overcomplicate everything. And then I want to repeat this anecdote that he told me about 3 weeks ago that last week I brought it in on our discussion about teaching because it's so powerful and relevant. About 3 weeks ago, he did a workshop with 25 corporate executives from a company they'll go unnamed, big national brand. And they got going, and the head guy had brought him in there, and Park had everybody write their ABTs, and he set to work on the first couple of them. And then he said about 20 minutes in to this like 4-hour workshop, the head guy cut him off and said, "Okay, Park, I think we've all got those 3 words down, and but therefore, what's next?" And then, I mean, that's the moment right there. There is no next. We're going to spend 4 hours working on and but therefore. And he said that guy, by the end of the 4 hours, had come around, and they went to dinner that night, and the guy said, "I got it. You know, I see how naive that was when I said 20 minutes in, what's next?" That's it. That's the core of the whole thing. Anybody got any
Randy,
other thoughts on Park? Yeah.
Yeah, I was
Jen.
just going to jump in and say, I think it's a perfect example of the Dunning-Kruger. You know, I'm sure you followed those
Yes.
two talks from one another for a very good reason, because as soon as someone says it's reductive and insulting, you're just like, yeah, that's because you're still way over here on this curve of understanding the power of this stuff. So, you know, it's yeah, and the anecdote you just shared is exactly the same thing. The other thing that really struck me about Park's talk is that I feel like he managed to verbalize exactly why I went from being a research scientist to being someone who trains people to communicate science, because he said, our jobs are all about connecting with audiences so we can make the complex simple so that we can get people to move into action. And that's exactly why I changed my career, because I couldn't see how the research that I was doing was ever going to inspire any action. And I just think that, to me, is such a good summary of why this stuff matters, because what's the point in having knowledge if it doesn't change anything?
And on that subject of simplicity and people wanting to complicate things, that will lead us to our next speaker, which I think is Jade, isn't it? Matt?
Yep, Jade's next.
Okay, so let her roll.
Like technical difficulty. Let me try.
I've got the right accent. Should I pretend? I can't quite remember what she said, but
You can,
I know it's all about shovels and spoons.
that is exactly right.
Yeah, while we're waiting too, if anyone wants to go back to the Twitter feed, I put a whole thread with hashtag Narrative Blitz, and you could see pictures and some of the takeaways, including these ABTs for everybody.
What a superstar, Liz.
Yeah, that's the truth. Exactly. Thank you, Liz. Matt, are we there now?
Let's give it a shot.
All live in such a manically busy world these days, and you might feel like you just don't have time to dedicate to practicing the ABT. But do you really want to be an inefficient communicator all your life? I think not. Therefore, I want to talk to you about why it's worth taking the time to find the time to get your communication right.
Wonderful. And one of the great things in this little journey we're all on, for many of us, it's 7 years now, is that people come up with these bits and pieces, and then it's kind of like selection goes to work. And if they're really profound, they stick around. And if they're not, we forget them. Jade came up with that. It's 6 years now, I think, since we did that AAAS video, and it's in there. In her video, she talks about the spoons and shovels analogy and says, you know, in Australia, we have this expression that you don't want to be that person who's busy digging with a spoon when if only you would pick up the shovel, you could get so much more done. And that has been so profound. We've used it so much over and over again. That was at the core of what her whole ABT was there. Let's see what Dr. Limerick had to say about it. Of the various riffs on the don't make the mistake of trying to save time and bringing on results will undermine your success and injure your cause. This presentation's Australian folk saying carries the day. Saving time by continuing to flail at the earth with the spoon while letting the shovel sit idle is not the path of wisdom, though evoking that folk phrase deepens the proposition that there is wisdom in investing time up front to avoid frustration later on. To increase receptivity to this idea, the opening of the ABT, we all live in a maniacally busy world, is sure to cause every listener to think, quote, this person knows me and understands what I'm facing. The assertion of the value of rest time will also enlist warm feelings from the harried, especially as the proposition here of people feeling so flat out echoes effectively with Julie Claussen's memorable repetition of the phrase, I'm fried. On that note, Julie, why don't you start the comments on this one? Are you still fried?
I think Julie must have fallen off the call, Randy. I can't see her.
Oh, shucks. You know, I think she said she had to run off and do something after a while. So anyhow, on that note, Mike, you had a couple short comments on that one.
Yeah, I just had one. I have to say that Jade was the second person in this ABT universe I met. Randy showed up with this Australian woman, and I wondered what this was all about. But so my comment was that Jade is always great. We must be on the right track, because we even have someone, and I can say, Jen, including you, now to someone's saying so in Australian.
Yeah, and we speak a totally different language to you Yanks. So
that is at times.
I congratulate you for the simultaneous translation, because I seem to be able to understand everything they say.
That's because we're all such good communicators.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, or at least you think you understand what they're saying.
Yeah.
That's part of the challenge. Marlis, did you want to speak for Julie on that one?
Well, yeah, my brain is fried too, so I don't have much to say. But, well, with that shovel and spoon, I always think of it differently. You know, I didn't know about this expression, but we say that scientists often dig with a steam shovel in a sandbox. So that we, you know, this goes also back to this complexity. We often look for too much detail, too powerful to want to do another analysis. So it's kind of an analogy to, you know, using similar, you know, shovels, spoons, steam shovels, but both aim at simplicity. That it's really important to look for simplicity, and the ABT helps in that.
The relevance of that expression from Jade for me over the last 6 or 7 years is I've now had at least 10 different political campaigns that people have tried to get me in to get them to listen to the ABT and say, you know, this could be really valuable in your communications, the campaign. And what you find with these politicians is once they've launched their campaign, they are so flat out busy with digging with their little spoons. They do not have the ability to stop for 1 second, broaden their mind out, and listen to anything whatsoever. And I've just given up on the whole political world in that regard. If someday a politician comes to me and says they're ready to listen, then I'll try and give it some effort. But I've burned up so much energy trying to explain this to them. And once people are off and running like that, they're so content focused that they don't have the ability to think broader about form, which is what ABT is about. And so you can waste a lot of time on that. And you just kind of have to gauge those things as you go along. Some people are so frantic with that spoon, you're just not going to get them to change. Anybody else got thoughts on the spoon and shovel analogy?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, Rick.
Well, the first time I heard Jade say that, it struck me a little differently. It's my own shovel thing. And you brought up politics here, and that's a classic example. But I ran into this, you know, early on with folks in my own organization. And it's more like when you find yourself at the bottom of the hole, it's time to put the shovel down and stop digging. And, you know, the idea of politicians, once they get on it, and you experience that, I mean, we experienced that here in North Dakota with the initiated measure, right? We were digging a hole, and by God, we were going to keep digging it, and don't tell us any different way to do it. And yet we should have put down the shovel and
well, yeah, but that's a little apples and oranges. You're using a different digging analogy there or metaphor.
I am, except the point is that you know, if you know, again, going back to the politics of things, you just keep digging the hole deeper and deeper.
Yeah,
and
I
deeper.
think it's the people that get the blinders on like
Right.
that. You can't
Yeah.
stop. Nancy, do you want to say something?
Well, just that someone in my life who shall go nameless continues to type with two fingers, which to me drives me absolutely insane.
And have you had a few years of observing this?
Yes, more than a few.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, that's to me the classics, but it's true. I mean, but you know, in the defense of this unnamed person, I mean, it's also the case that I never put all of my references into a reference database. So every time I write a paper, I type out each reference. Maybe I cut and paste it from another thing, but you know, I never somehow took the time to figure out how to use EndNote. So, you know, everybody has their image of what's just too big enough. Of course, now that I'm 72, you know, but you do have to make some calculations about what's worth investing in. But ABT is worth investing in even at 72.
But I think you're right. Everybody's got software that they just haven't found the time to learn how to use it right. And so they've got all these glitches that they just, me worse than everybody else. Let's see. Let's move on to the next one. And what Patty Limerick, I believe, is next. Ooh,
the fear of being called a fool afflicts nearly everyone. Fear. This fear has long seemed perfectly reasonable. But this fear shuts off access to innovation, creativity, and courage. Therefore, the time has come to get over fool phobia. The fear of being called a fool.
Okay. Therefore, yeah, time to get over fear phobia. Right. Sorry, I keep forgetting that these things end on the therefore. And she doesn't have any comments on her own ABT, of course. But the one thing I will say about her ABT that is really fascinating is that, and she and I continue to talk about this. She had given that talk about the fool in the course at least 4 or 5 times. And every time she gave it, it was really nice. And it got 1 or 2 comments. And then in the last round, we showed that video, her Blitz video that is 3.5, 4 minutes long. And when that ended, the chat room lit up with about literally 8 to 10 comments and questions over the next minute or two. And she and I just couldn't believe it. Something very profound happened there, which was that when she gave that talk herself and ambled along showing slides and remembering what she wanted to say, didn't light that fire inside of people the way that narrative does. When they watched the video of her that was so compactly edited down to 3.5 minutes, it lit fires in people's minds and they instantly had things to say. And that's what you get with filmmaking, with tight editing and narrative and all those sorts of things. That's why we do these things. That's why the Blitz is really a powerful event, because it's not a symposium. It's not a bunch of people giving talks where they're ambling along. It is more like a film where we edited down and got them really into tight form. And that's why it rolls along that sort. And the fool thing is wonderful. And Patty is so thrilled with it. She's been cultivating that idea for 30 to 40 years and never quite had an application of it until this course came along. And now she loves showing that video to friends and doing more stuff with it. People got thoughts about, I mean, that of all the videos in the whole Blitz, I think that one's the one that kind of stole everybody's hearts because of her fool outfit, the court jester outfit that she wears as she gives it. Thoughts, anybody? Mike, you want to start on comment about the fool?
First of all, I got to read you my extensive comments, which were love it, just perfect.
Yeah. Which is, yeah, of all the videos that we've been showing, that's the one that probably we've shown the most for that very reason, that it comes together tightly. Hey, Dianna, you have applied it. Patty's thrilled when I've told her about in your presentations, of course, now a couple of times you've used the concept of the fool to talk about people from other disciplines when they're reviewing your proposal. You got any thoughts on that in her talk?
You're on mute, Dianna.
The trick is that I think people have to understand what she means by the fool, and they have to take themselves out of that notion of not being taken seriously, whatever, but rather being outside the circle of the political realm, outside the common things, and that person who looks in from outside. And as I've said, is that that person plays a really important role when you're trying to effectively communicate something as complex as a grant proposal, because they can tell you if what you're saying is going to make sense to someone who's not. And so I use it as an example now when I'm talking to others about how important it is that, you know, everybody be able to communicate. I just wrote this giant, very too complicated grant. It's called Convergence Grant, that has people from extremely different disciplines all working together on a single goal. And everyone said, well, I'm just going to read my part. I said, no, everybody's got to read everybody else's part. The architects have got to read the engineers. They've got to read the ecology. The ecologists have got to read the engineering and the architecture. And everybody's got to be able to read and understand each other's parts. And so that I said that we're playing essentially the role of a fool, because half of them are, you know, liberal arts majors in their youth or whatever. They know what it is if you put it into the context of, you know, liberal arts education, I guess.
Yeah, let me say something about the Blitz and what you're talking about right there for everybody, which is that we've run the Narrative Blitz twice, and we had 1,500 people sign up the first time. The second time it was only about 100 because we charged $10 each, and the National Park Service didn't promote it. But I think we might do it again in late September, because even with those 100, there was a lot of great results of the whole thing, and everybody thoroughly enjoyed it a second time. And we know that iteration is important with this stuff. And I think that we'll probably do it in late September, October without charging next time around, and get the organizations to put their strength behind it. And in the meanwhile, we don't want to post all the videos out there. We don't want to make them public. We don't want everybody sharing them on the one hand. But on the other hand, for any of you and anybody listening to this, if you want to write to us and make a pitch for, could I possibly get the link for example, the Fool video? And Dianna, if you wanted to do this and just be able to share that with your group of people to give you that piece of vocabulary to talk with them exactly as you say, you know, you don't want to be calling them fools out of context, but if they've all seen this thing, suddenly it's a term. And I think that Patty and I, we continue to have weekly discussions, this stuff. I think we've got a big long-term agenda with some of these things, one of which is I'm pushing her to eventually find some venue where she could write an article about the Fool that it could be. This stuff is about branding. You know, you've got a term like the Fool, and what she needs to do is lead the charge to rebrand this term Fool into a functional concept like that, where people can actually get some value out of it in a discussion. Say, you know what, we need to bring in a fool, meaning this functional person who has the common sense, knows the narrative structure, but doesn't know our content at all and isn't hung up by that getting in the way. So for all of you, you know, don't hesitate to ask, can I get a copy of such and such video to share with this group? And yeah, that's part of the agenda. Anybody?
Can I jump in, Randy? Because
yes,
to me, this is exactly what I try and do with my students. I find for a lot of science students, they've had negative experiences where they haven't understood something scientific and they thought they should. So that's where the whole kind of imposter comes from. You know, I feel like I should be able to understand what my professor's saying, but I can't. And in my classes, which are all interdisciplinary, so I have a chemist sitting next to a botanist, sitting next to an epidemiologist, sitting next to a geologist, and I make them explain their work until each other understands it. And I try and get them to see this value of the Fool, that it's not a negative that you don't understand, because if you don't understand, that just means the person hasn't explained it to you properly, and it's actually on them that they need to do it better. So I love this idea of people embracing their disciplinary naivety or their disciplinary lack of knowledge, and seeing that as a huge asset when we're trying to become better communicators. So I just love Patty's talk.
Yeah, and as Mike said he had nothing critical to say about it. It really is one of the tightest of all of them, and it's actually extra good when it's joined together with the excerpt from Jane's talk right afterwards, where she tells about the working circle where they had the quote Fool, and they're the guy from the business world who turned out to be the guy asking the best, most important questions because he didn't have content clogging his perception of the whole thing. Other thoughts on the Fool before we move on to the next one? Yeah, Marlis.
I think the key word is in her butt statement, courage, because it takes courage to both being able to be a fool and actually standing up and asking dumb questions, but also to accept the fool asking you questions, being questioned. Well, I have no clue what you just told me the last 5 minutes. And so I think it's a very powerful concept, and I think it takes courage both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember so many departmental seminars where the junior people would be terrified to ask the dumb question, and you'd finally get the senior person who has enough experience and confidence that would just say, look, I'm lost. Can you explain this one thing to me? And you could feel all the younger people sighing, well, thank you for just asking that question. It's a whole syndrome that, you can't risk it looking like a dummy sometimes. So, okay, let's see. On that note, let's move on to the next one, who the speaker is with us, so we can really tear this one apart. Matt, you want to play the next ABT?
The topic of misinformation has received a great deal of attention, and much of the analyses of it tend to treat it as though it's somehow different from other information, but it's not. Therefore, I want to talk to you about how the ABT framework applies to the challenge of misinformation.
Great. And Patty had to say, while innumerable pundits keep up a chorus of dismay, the mischief and misery that the torrent of misinformation has brought to the world, this presentation offers a response that's equally novel and promising. And of course, the promise arises from its novelty. Drawing a distinction between content and form provides the illumination. Information uncrafted and simply set forward stands a good chance of delivering boredom, but it is in the form that makes the communication carry interest. Malefactors and miscreants can and do use the format of the ABT to propagate misinformation, but lamenting the inaccuracy and danger of their information or content doesn't add up to much. In a dramatic contrast, mobilizing the ABT framework to counter misinformation holds the infinite promise. The summation, quote, the best defense against misinformation is a clear, powerful, true narrative, registers as most convincing of marching orders. If enough people were to embrace that idea, the pandemic of misinformation might actually confront an effective vaccine. The word misinformation, after all, relies on its intimate association with the word information, which, with four syllables, could ingest overrule and drown out that feeble little prefix of miss. Mike, did you like her comments there? That's kind of cool what she had to say.
Yeah, I sort of wish she did my talk. So
she is very erudite. Anybody thoughts on that one?
I did have a comment on it. If you want me to read it, my comments were, who is this guy and where did you dig him up from?
That sounds like misinformation to me.
Yeah.
Rick, you want to rip that presentation to pieces?
Well, I'd sure like to, but I obviously can't because, Mike always does such a great job. And I think Patty was right on about that as well. We live in the misinformation era, quite frankly. And so I always come back to this strong narrative as the counter. And that really struck me really significantly when first time I heard that, because every day is a day of misinformation. And the way to deal with misinformation of any sort is that strong narrative.
Sad, but true. Yeah. I mean, it's just the race is to the swift, whoever can tell the best tightly argued piece of logic, really. Very difficult. Other thoughts and comments on misinformation, Mike's talk?
Well, I think the most important point that you made, Mike, and I thought your talk was terrific, was just that people who are willing to share misinformation have this incredibly powerful advantage that they're not constrained by accuracy or truth. So as soon as you're not constrained by the facts, and if you do have a handle on how to communicate effectively and with a narrative, then of course you're going to rise above the noise and be visible. And we're having an incredible time at the moment in Australia with our vaccine rollout, and there's some shocking misinformation going around. And yeah, if you're not constrained by the truth, the world's your oyster, really. I think that's a really important thing to remember.
Yeah. And by the way, a little side comment on all of these discussions we're having here for anybody who's an outsider listening to this episode of the podcast. And this may sound like some big love fest where, oh, everybody did such a good job. Well, as I got near the end of editing all those videos together, I kept wondering from the start, there's going to be 2 or 3 weak links in this whole thing. And honest to goodness, by the end of it, there really is not a single one. Every one of the presentations are really solid. I think that's the result of 5-6 years of us doing this narrative stuff. And there's nothing contrived in it. So this isn't artificial of just a big kind of praise and complimentary session. They all have a lot of substance to them. And so, Rick.
I want to weigh in on that a little bit, Randy. On that same point for folks that may not be familiar with all of us and what we do, this wasn't easy to do that blitz. And I'll just use my little short talk, we did 3 different versions of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
You had one of the tougher experiences, as a matter of fact.
I mean, the first one, quite honestly, stunk.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The second one was better, but it wasn't quite there. And then the third one was the one thing, right? We finally got there. So all of these take a lot of work. So reiterating that, I think, is important for folks that are listening.
You know, we could make a very good making of video about your presentation, because it's also circular. We start off with Rick. He and I wrote this convoluted whole thing about the singular narrative. Well, if you're going to talk about the singular narrative, it better be pretty simple and singular. And it better not go on and on for 5 minutes about all the details about how it's really important to be simple. And no, it's got to embody what you're talking about. And that's what we eventually found our way to, which in the end, your thing was as simple as the one clip and just, the one thing, which was perfect. That was your niche in the whole thing that slotted right in there. Good afternoon, Mike Backus. Thank you for joining us. We are just rambling here on all the different presentations. And we just finished talking about misinformation, but let's see, we'll have you join in on the next one. So next one is Kirsten Lin. If you want to, what we're doing here is playing the ABT for each one and then jumping in with discussion. Take it away, Matt.
As scientists, we publish scientific papers with a lot of important information, and we want people to act on the information to help solve problems. But scientific publications aren't compelling to many of the people who we're trying to reach. Therefore, let me tell you about a case study where we use the Story Circles training to take a peer-reviewed publication into meaningful action.
And here's what Nancy had to say, is this presentation is crystal clear in putting forward the recognition the speaker and her teammates reached. The impasse between 2 groups advocating opposite positions on those darn cats, leave it to Patty, those darn cats, arose from the fact that the 2 groups were actually talking about different problems. The doubled enterprise of translating the academic jargon into accessible language and making the statements of the 2 groups intelligible to each other short-circuited the stalemate, and an outcome rightly saluted by the quarantinis. Sorry. This piece raises a crucial idea that figures in a number of other statements. The ABT method can play a major role in reducing the noise of public discourse and rearranging the lines of what had long seemed to be stark opposition. That's a statement I wish we could have just added at the end of Kirsten's whole presentation, because that really just hammers home why hers is such a good one, a real world case. Liz, why don't you start? A fair amount, don't you, about the issue to start with of the 2 warring factions about cats there in Hawaii. Got any thoughts, Liz?
Yeah, it's a really contentious issue, like she talks about during the Blitz. And the whole thing for me, what really resonated about this was the context part. And they nailed this by figuring out the message it should be for really different audiences. And this is the same thing we see in conservation. This is why I have a story kind of similar, going from becoming a natural scientist to a social scientist myself, because a lot of times you see these like expert driven campaigns based on what we think the audience needs or what motivates them. So this brings in establishing the context. What are the motivations of the audiences? They did that through audience research of the 2 different groups, figured out what they needed to hear that would help them see basically the solution to the problem. So that made it more effective because they established the context, they did the research, and they were able to then use the messaging and the ABT structure and all this narrative stuff and the fiction to develop compelling messages. And it wasn't like a one size fits all, and they realized that. And a lot of times we see that. We're just trying to go off into a room, figure out what needs to happen, and not talk to the people that are actually impacted by these issues. So it brought a lot of this stuff to the forefront, and I was really happy to see it happening in general, and the fact that's happening here and on that particular issue. So I was so excited that she was part of it.
It was really a perfect case study. Mike Backus, I've got a question for you related to that. Mike, where are you, in LA or in Hawaii?
I'm in Hawaii. I'm in LA.
Okay.
Go to Hawaii soon.
Okay, you spent time there in Hawaii. You had said to me a couple months ago about one of the great powers of the ABT is in building bridges. Got any thoughts on that? And this,
yeah. I mean, I think the big idea, one of the big ideas behind ABT is this idea that so much language these days is used to distinguish and separate. And the interesting thing about ABT is that if it's used with some degree of fluency, then it can be used to find common ground, get your point across without raising the hackles of the other side. And, you know, I mean, we need a lot more of it. I mean, you know, you pick up any editorial page in the US, you can very, very quickly distinguish the kinds of, you know, editorial statements that are designed to inflame and the ones that are trying to build a bridge or reach some kind of common ground.
And I think that's taken a further degree with social media, where they just chop off the context and the setup there and go right to the problem. And
yeah, I mean, yeah, it's you know, social media often is always the pointy tip of the spear and nothing else.
Yeah, truly. Other thoughts, comments on that case study?
I'll throw one in here. You know, we've dealt
and
with
then
this.
Then Marlis. So go for it, Rick.
We've dealt with this a number of times in the course where people say, well, what do you do when you have, you know, two audiences that are opposing one another? And what's so powerful about this presentation is it's that real world example. I mean, it's clear that they have two different problems. And so when we say to people, well, you got to start with agreement, and then they say, well, how do you do that when you're opposing? This is a classic example of making sure we both agree on what the problem is before we start putting the and statement together.
And this is such a good case study because it's got such simple little labels there that embrace the two sides, which was homeless cats versus invasive species. And that just in an instant gets you right into the core of what the divide is. Marlis, you had a thought?
Yeah, I think it's a prime example, the power of context. You know, once they agreed there were too many cats, so we have to find a solution to make numbers of cats smaller, then everybody was signing on. But to make it relevant to these very different groups was providing the context. And in conservation, we often, face this, that some people are coming from hunting and the other coming from more the conservation type of environmental movements. And often if you can agree on a problem and the solution, and then you go to talk to constituents, make it relevant to them with different contexts. For me, that was a very, very good learning experience from her, a simple example.
And what sort of credentials do you have when it comes to context?
None whatsoever.
No, you're supposed to say, I'm the one that gave the talk about context in the Narrative Blitz.
Yes. This is just something I learned, working in applied conservation, where we do genetics and try to explain this to managers and so on, how important it is, making it relevant to them, but also for students, when you try to teach students how they can make their research relevant to a larger audience, not just their lab members, then context really matters. But this is something which is very, very difficult for students to learn. You have to accumulate a lot of knowledge to place it in proper context.
Yeah, I think that was one of our lessons last week with how to teach the ABT. I think it was that sort of the bottom line, which is that we know now the big problem early on is developing context. So why don't you make that clear to students? If you want to learn this communication stuff, the number one place really to go to work on is understanding what context is, how you get a grasp on it, and knowing you're never going to communicate well unless you put a lot of focus on understanding what's meant by all that analytically, as we've done. Jen, did you have thoughts on the cats?
Oh, Jen's on mute.
Now I'm on mute, sorry. I was just going to say, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, but the other thing that really struck me in this talk was just it reminds us again how useless scientific papers can be. So they're very useful for some things, but if everything we find out we put out in academic papers, if that's not our audience, it's this fundamental problem of, researchers get rewarded for publishing in high quality journals, high impact factors, citation rates. But if that's actually not the audience who needs to know what your research is about, that's a big problem.
Yeah, she had that great example in her talk of the figure in the research paper that was like spaghetti. And then their broader version that they've gotten a lot of mileage out of. That was really a good illustration of how you got to translate that stuff. Liz, did you have final thought?
Yeah. Just because this comes up in the course all the time, people are asking, well, how do I know? How do I know my audience needs to hear, right? Or what the context is. And Marlis just said it, you go and talk to them. So I just wanted to underscore that. That's what we do in social science. Like you could do some simple interviews or just talk to your audience, find them, survey them, do something so that you have something to go on and not just your assumptions. Because over and over, we find that, you know, the quote experts, we're making assumptions. So, you know, do the little bit of work and you'll not just get context, but you'll have accurate context that applies to your specific situation.
Excellent. And Matt, how about if we move on to Pete? I think he's next, right?
Randy, do you realize in the meantime, we've spent a whole hour just doing the first half of what we wanted to do
we're
today?
getting there. I'm keeping an eye on the clock. We'll get through this. So, yeah, moving on to Pete. We're on the home stretch.
I've given many talks over the years. Usually they're well received. Then one day I gave one in Berkeley, and Randy Olson was in the audience. He came up to me afterwards and said, "Pete, you gave a great talk. You can do better." Therefore, I asked him to help me over the next several months forge an upcoming keynote talk into a powerful narrative using ABT.
Oh, shucks. Matt, did you edit that into the more condensed version?
Yeah, I didn't figure like a long blank audio pause for no reason would be great for our audio only listeners.
It would have been excellent. I would have sat here and made gestures during it.
Once again, lost on the audio only crowd. So.
That's true. Well, it would have been crickets. We should have brought in some crickets.
Yeah, that's true. I should have just had like a cricket soundtrack.
Better crickets.
Randy, I feel like it would have been really important to play the audio where Pete makes the point of how incredibly demanding, annoying, and even worse you were. I think that was the best part of the whole talk.
Yes, that's at the end, exactly. And then his weird pause at the end that I insisted on sticking in there that he hated me for. Yeah, this was a total manipulation for both he and poor Jane, but I've had so much fun working with them. I had to do it. And in Pete's, there was that pause that I put in there artificially with him saying, I think you know what's coming. And then there's a long pause. And he finally says, but, and that's the deal, was that he gave a talk here in LA, actually said Berkeley. And it was a good talk, but it was an and talk. And then he said, could we go to lunch tomorrow and have you give me the full critique? And I said, are you sure you want it? I say this to a lot of people. Are you sure you want the whole thing? And he said, yes. Well, the whole thing was a lot. And Matt, is that
Mike Backus, can have you mute yourself? We're getting some feedback from you.
Oh, wow. And so the good news with Pete was that he had all the raw material there. He had all in the and he had all these things. All I really did with him was rearrange things to give it a narrative structure, to have it be a journey. And that's what was really fun. It did work really well with the presentation when he finally gave it. Let's see. I don't know that there's a lot to discuss in that ABT that he had there, because it was mostly about me. And we all know we don't want to talk about me in this presentation.
Yes, we want to talk about you, but not with you present.
Yeah, exactly. Revenge.
We'll do it another time.
I will have you know that a nickname has emerged for me with this group of guys that I played tennis with for the past 2 or 3 years. And the nickname is effing Randy, without giving you the expletive. So there's a whole story behind that. So that said, let's move on to the next one, if we could, Matt. And is this going to be Jose?
Acting is communication, and as with all effective communication, requires thinking, feeling, and imagination. But the core of powerful acting, just like communication, is not cerebral. It is the simplicity of an action. Therefore, let me tell you about a sign upstage center on the wall of my classroom at the legendary Neighborhood Playhouse School of Theater in New York City that said, "Act before you think."
Okay, great. And we'll dive in on that one in a minute. Actually, I realized I skipped Patty's comments on Pete's, and I really do want to get this in here. So let me read what Patty had said, because she doesn't have anything on Jose's. But going back to Pete's talk, she said, misguided souls who think that an ABT narrative is formulaic and predictable can benefit from hearing this tale of adventure on a dark and stormy night in Camden, New Jersey, in the company of the Society of Plastics Engineers, which does seem like a group that Brian Palermo and his improvisational theater comrades might have created. In this story, tension fills the air with vivid detail evoking empathy as big burly guys cause a critic of the chemical industry to feel physically afraid. But then the tension lifts and suddenly reveals that forthright communication can unleash an unexpected congeniality. But if I am not misinterpreting, and I may be, this change did not exactly ease the mind of the critic of the chemical industry, whose mission in life was not to find new opportunities to make money, albeit in a less damaging way for the chemical industry. Adding another twist to the tale, the exchange between Dr. Myers and Dr. Olson at the end of the video is one of my favorite moments in the Blitz, with the suspense of Dr. Myers' averting gaze melting into the word good. So that was that moment that was at the end of his video that I thought was priceless. I had to put in there, which is we were recording and he finished the take and then he just looks away, and I've forgotten. I'm laughing at him or something for having badgered him so much. And I said, I think that's good enough. And he said, good to be done. Okay. So let's see, getting back to Jose's and Mike Backus, you might be a good one to weigh in on this. He talked about the Meisner technique and about the power and importance of simplicity and Meisner and all that he stood for. And this would be good to hear from you because you're the next presentation there. Mike is the guy that put me into the acting course 27 years ago that changed my entire life, and it still was important, informative. And then Jose was a student of Sanford Meisner and tracked us down and really has completely meshed with the whole ABT framework. So your thoughts, Mike, on the ABT and Meisner?
Learn your lines. No, but I mean, really, the thing about it is that the simplicity happens when you're really, 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 really familiar with the material. And therefore, when you spent the time to take it apart, develop an ABT structure, deliver an ABT structure, and remove as much unnecessary clutter as you can, I think the power of your communication is directly proportional to the level of simplicity in that communication. A lot of people, and I'm guilty of it as much as anybody, what happens is they have a tendency to, when they're learning a topic, they want to prove that they know the topic. And the thing that's interesting is knowing the topic and communicating the topic, as we know, are two different things. And the simplicity of mastery is what you're going for. And ABT is kind of the spine for it to some degree. So,
yeah, one really unfortunate example I've taken to using, Liz, I'm sorry, you and Jade both, but I think this really is reflective of everybody, which is that in the wake of the Blitz, both Jade and Liz, with the best of intentions, sent me emails suggesting adding another element of complexity to the inner outer circle diagram that we've gotten so much mileage out of. And 5 of the talks use that thing, just these 2 concentric circles. And the power of that diagram is its sheer simplicity. So Jade had offered the idea of a 3rd circle on the outside for hostile voices. And then Liz had suggested taking the outer circle and segmenting it, breaking into subsections. And for both of them, I pushed back and said, this is the natural instinct to take something good. I mean, Mike, what was that? You and I had this discussion a couple of years ago from the world of video games. What's the whole term and concept there, that all these video games emerge in simple form, they're popular, and then they evolve into all this complexity and bog themselves down, and eventually they become less popular. What's that whole concept, Mike?
Well, I mean, in anything, in any media, things have a tendency to, like films get more complex, but they don't necessarily get clearer in conveying the story or evoking the emotion. And, in a lot of art, I mean, simplicity is really, really hard. And complexity is the smokescreen that a lot of people use to convince people that they've mastered an idea or completely exploring a topic, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah. And why don't we just segue right into Mike's talk then? Matt, if you want to play his ABT, because it goes right with this.
Just a sec, another technical difficulty. Give me 10 seconds there.
No problem. And so Mike's talk is about Michael Crichton and his fondness for simplicity as well. Mike, could you say 1 or 2 words about the Meisner technique and how simplicity is also at the core of that?
Well, yeah, I don't know if I can use it without inappropriate language. The thing is that, yeah, finding the emotional reality in a situation requires a much, much simpler approach than most people think. And the problem is as has been mentioned, you don't want to think. You want to be in the moment, and you want to be able to react to another person. And that's the truth is found in simplicity. And really good actors can find a simple action and use that action to keep them on point.
Which is exactly what Jose's little bit was that he told in there, was that anecdote of coming up to Harvey Keitel, telling him the whole complicated of his story, and then Harvey just saying one simple thing to him was, what does he do? And that was it. And then in that moment, Jose, I got it. What you just said, what's the simple actions that convey all the complicated stuff going on inside of him? Okay. Yeah. Can we play that, Matt?
You got it.
We've built a world of rapid and ubiquitous communication, which seems like a great thing. But the truth is, science was communicated more effectively 100 years ago. Therefore, I want to tell you about a little paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1975 titled Medical Obfuscation.
So I wish there was a way to convey to the entire world of science that simple statement, which was 100 years ago, communication was better and more effective and efficient than it is today. I mean, it's still relative terms, but there just isn't this broader understanding of the amount of noise going on, ending up with the debacle we've just had for the past year and a half of the pandemic, which communication was really pretty damn bad, and 500,000 people died. And I don't think there's any sort of self-examination going on about that in the science world, about how we blew it. Science folks just don't seem to want this critical examination. People got thoughts on that? The idea that 100 years ago, communication was better?
Only in just that I completely agree. And I thought, Mike, your comment about Michael Crichton's piece that was so profound and made this really important point, and then to say 45 years later it's even worse. We haven't learned anything. We haven't started improving this. And there's been some interesting papers coming out recently where people have made the point of just how impossible it has become to understand things, sometimes even in their own field, because each little tiny subdiscipline ends up with this huge plethora of jargon. I mean, where are we heading? Is our aim to not be able to understand anybody else? Because we seem to be, tracking pretty well towards that.
The communication challenge is not a popular thing to be talked about. Everybody feels like it's too much inside baseball. A month ago, Michael Lewis, the author, was on 60 Minutes talking about his book that he just come out about the pandemic. It's called Premonition. And it was the story of 7 epidemiologists who, a year ago, this last January, before the epidemic or the pandemic really started in the US, they had the sense that this was going to be really bad. And they went to work and they did all that they could. And at the end of the segment, he said, sadly, this book is 7 stories of 7 superheroes who failed in their mission because they did everything they could and they worked heroically. But in the end, 500,000 people died. So they failed. So let's not try and celebrate, which I thought was really great, really accurate. But the story that he didn't tell was the failure of the communication of the science biomedical community, because nobody wants to read that. People want to hear heroic stories of superheroes that tried to beat the system. And even if they failed, the people would rather read that than to read about the mess that communication ends up becoming, where there's no singular voice. And last thing to add to that was you all know that I went to work with Michael Osterholm for 4 months, and he was on Biden's advisory board. And he was the one guy on that board out of 13 epidemiologists who kept pointing to communication. We're not communicating with a singular voice. The public's not getting a clear signal. They're being spun in circles. And that never really was addressed. The whole thing, eventually the vaccine came along and they just swept all that stuff aside. And I don't see a lot of learning going on from that. So these communication problems continue endlessly. Marlis, yes.
I would like to add to what Michael said, that 100 years ago, scientists were better communicators. And I agree with that. And there might be the arguments, today they're much more specialized, there's more detail to know. But I think they were also trained 100 years ago in multiple disciplines. So they were, medical doctors, botanists, zoologists, engineers, geologists. And to some extent, this provided much broader context for them, but they also could serve as their own fool in one area, because they had other perspectives. So I think that that's very important too, that 100 years ago, they had a bigger breadth and then could kind of cross-check and say, yeah, that doesn't make sense if I think about this as like an engineer. And so that may have helped them too, being better communicators.
And I think your point goes even further than that, which is that they were even so broad as to have a solid background in the humanities. And out of that arises the ability to communicate more effectively. I think that that's really fundamental. The thing I mentioned in my Don't Be Such a Scientist book was something I got from Naomi Oreskes, historian of science, who said to me that 100 years ago, you couldn't be a scientist if you couldn't communicate, because there was no government grants to be given to you. You had to convince your friends and neighbors to give you money to do research. And the only way you're going to pull that off is if you managed to communicate about it effectively. And so World War II changed all that. We built these great research institutes and began to cultivate this whole species of scientists that can simply ask for money and be given a pile of money, and they don't really have to have some of those skills. Other thoughts on that topic? That will then lead us to our final ABT, I believe, isn't it, Matt? And that's Carrie?
Jane Monk first, actually.
Oh, sorry. Okay, Jane and then Carrie. Yeah, go for it.
The ABT may seem like a magic wand, and you can wave it at any material and make it compelling. But there's a social imperative to developing narrative. Therefore, I want to talk to you now about using the ABT framework in the real world.
It's so good. And Jane is awesome. Let's see, got to get these Patty Limerick statements in here. And I forgot to read the one for Mike's talk. So let me read that. Patty had said, this reconsideration of Michael Crichton extends the theme that is central to the two preceding presentations. Deploying the ABT can challenge the custom very popular in 2021 of drawing lines of opposition that block opportunity for reciprocal benefit and exchange. Yes, Michael Crichton went oppositional to science later in life, but early in life, he made overtures to scientists, inviting them to rethink their conventional presentation of self and their conventional claim on authority, ending with a graceful evocation of the likelihood that Crichton would have liked the ABT framework. This presentation expands the range of possibilities for unexpected alliances in the supportive narrative, reaching into the past and into the future. She's such a good writer, and that's really great. And that adds to everything that was said. So let me read her comments then on Jane. She said, one of the most effective features of many of these videos, a feature that I have for no reason I can think of, failed to mention until now, is the inclusion of images that complement the spoken words. But now the very image of an aspiring ABT author who has made the very bad choice to work on this his own ABT in a creepy place with imitations of mortality in his immediate proximity requires me to note the excellent incorporation of visual imagery in many of the presentations, which I won't deny that I appreciate most of all when a fool suddenly appears among the nation's founders. After we contemplate the dreadful setting where the I want to be alone preferences of the writer has placed him, the story circles, working circles present, a far preferable setting for intellectual labor. Once again, the payoff from investment of time gets a forceful endorsement. And of course, it's nice to have the fool's contribution recognized. Even nicer to have the fool's favorite generalization. Everybody works better when they're having fun brought into play. The lessons presented here gain credibility by connecting to a defined scientific question, plastic pollution and chemicals, food packaging, a topic that had better be connected to a social imperative. Those are all great comments. And Jane is such a trooper and a good sport. She is in Switzerland, so sadly, she's always out of sync for timing with all of our events because it's 9 hours later over there. She wanted to join this discussion, but it's midnight there, I think. But she's very social, and she was the organizer for that whole food packaging forum event called Unwrapped that I worked with Pete on to give the keynote there. And then she single-handedly got funding and ran story circles in Switzerland with a group of folks in Europe. And now we're working on them running half of the course this fall, being a partner in the course. And she totally got it on the social nature on working circles. She loved it when we came. It was working circles, has been a participant in a number of them. And that's where this all evolved into her thing. I felt she was the best spokesperson about what we came to realize. And Rick, I think you're the guy that loves to weigh in on this. So share your little thought about the social imperative.
So I was thinking about that as I was listening to you, because that indeed is what resonates with me. And she said it, there better be a social imperative because all conservation problems are social, but we give them to biologists to solve.
Okay, wait a second. Can you repeat that slowly and dissect it for us? Because we've echoed that a lot.
Okay. So the quote is, and I can't give you the origin. I've been unable to find who originally said it, but the quote is this: all conservation problems are social, but we give them to biologists to solve. And the first time I heard that, it hit me between the eyes like a 2x4. And Liz and I have had this discussion over and over and over about social science engagement and conservation. And so that better be a social imperative quote is right on the money.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and in a profession that tends to drift towards the less social in behavior, it's a huge problem. Nancy, yeah.
I used to always tell my students that.
You're locking up there in the far reaches of Maine.
Changing the behavior. Can you? I said.
Let me turn your video off, Nancy. Maybe that'll help.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay. Try that again. You always tell your students it was turning into monster voice.
But conservation is about changing the behavior of people, not the behavior of whales.
One more time, can you say you always tell your students what?
Number 3, the conservation is about changing the behavior of people, not changing the behavior of whales.
Great. Yes. Okay.
Can I add to that? Because I don't want the natural scientists to get all defensive and all that from that quote, right? But what we need is the partnerships and what we were just talking about, the interdisciplinary nature of science. And a natural scientist can just write a social scientist into their grant proposal from the outset and do it the right way. So I just had to say that. I see the thumbs up. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah, I mean, it's so deep because scientists have a do-it-yourself nature to them. I know this from way back in the graduate school and watching some of these professors just doing everything themselves. Much as I love some of them, one particular professor who we spent a lot of time with, was constantly making his own field equipment that was poorly designed and things like that. I can do this myself well enough. And they do it a lot with communication, and it shouldn't happen. There really is some niche partitioning that should go on. And it's unfortunate when you see these things taking place like that. And this kind of leads then to our final ABT, which kind of grades together with this. Matt, this is now Carrie, right?
Yes, this is now Carrie. One sec.
Perfect. We're right on schedule here to wrap things up.
The National Park Service has long been known as America's storytellers, and at our 423 national parks, we do a great job with interpretation and education. But our mission is more than just talking. The National Park Service needs to lead as well. Therefore, let's start with why the ABT framework has become popular in the National Park Service.
And that's really a great one to finish on because they've been our big partner. I've been working with them for 10 years now. And one of the things, yesterday I had a Zoom session with a biomedical group that wants to probably do the course. And I was talking to them across the spectrum that we've been running this stuff. We go all the way from the analytical level, reductionist level of molecular folks, and like Genentech being the extreme example way out there, then all the way up to the large scale organization of conservation groups and ecology groups and things like that. And the larger scale folks are the easier meshing with them. They get this stuff, the power of narrative. They understand multivariate stuff better. I think there's something to do with that, why it meshes easier with them. And National Park Service has been the dream partner of all of them. They're the ones that came to us already saying, we know story is really important. We know this narrative stuff's important, and we know we don't do as good a job as we need to. Can you work with us? And when we get that for the opening signal, it's so fun, and we can do so much with them, as opposed to some of these groups at the more analytical level that have fought us to some extent. Like, we don't see the value of this. So they've been the dream partnership. And one thing I want to add here at the end, which is the mission that we're on, we're booming at this point. The fall is now booked with, we've got 4 organizations that are splitting 2 rounds of the course in August for starters. That's locked in, starts August 3rd. And then we've got 7 or 8 different other organizations waiting for us to lock them in for the September, October, November. So it's not like we're in fighting mode anymore. I've spent years and years fighting for this stuff, arguing a lot with people. The tide has definitely shifted. People are getting the ABT framework. They're coming to us now all the time and saying, we want in on this. So it's fun. And it's kind of part of our mission to continue to solidify this and doing what we're doing. Once again, with last week's session on how to teach the ABT being so important, because that was locking in our core of knowledge right now in teaching. And none of us have the time and resources to be writing these PLOS papers, publishing this stuff, and nor do we want to get tangled up in all those battles. I think we're all just running as fast as we can to do what we can in the practical real world. And knowing that this stuff is, communication is far more experiential than it is analytical. And that is the challenge. It's what we learned day one in film school. Film is a visceral medium. It's experiential. I'm just right now tweaking the content of the narrative gym book that Park Howell and I are going to do a new edition of it for the business world. And reading in there this morning, one little section, I talked about this, that when I began making films 30 years ago now, while I was a professor, before I'd had any training at all, I went and bought this simple book called How to Make a Film. The first sentence of that book said, if you really want to learn how to make a film, put this book down, go buy a camera and start shooting film, because it's an experiential medium. You cannot read enough books that are going to make you into a good filmmaker. You've got to get out there and actually do it, just like sports. You know, you can't read enough books about surfing and then expect somehow I read enough books I can get on a board and tomorrow catch a giant wave. You've got to actually do the repetitive experiential thing. And this, of course, is my rub against the National Academy of Sciences and all the academics and professors who honestly think they can get together and do enough symposium, write enough papers that they can crack the nut of the science of science communication. And someday, miraculously, we'll give you these formulae that will help you communicate effectively. The experience side is crucial to it all. That is my final synthesis statement. Jen, speaking on behalf of Jade, who couldn't join us. Jen, you want to give us an overarching, and the rest of you are welcome as well to give final statements. I have spoken.
Well,
Jen.
This isn't overarching, but I think one of the points that Carrie makes that is so important is that if your organization or your colleagues or your team embrace something like the ABT, suddenly you have a shared language which allows you to provide targeted feedback. And to me, that is really important, because receiving and giving good quality feedback is hard to do, but it's essential if we want to get better at things. And as soon as you have a shared language, so you can shortcut into this is why this doesn't work, I think that's just so powerful. And as you said, narrative is leadership. You know, if we want to lead well and be led well, we have to understand narrative, and that shared tool is super important.
And on commentary, let me read Patty's final statement here. That's on Carrie's. She says, since so many of these presentations involve inquiries that are a world apart from arcane, abstract, quote, pure research, it makes very good sense to conclude the Blitz with a presentation that notes the direct relevance of narrative to leadership, but leadership linked to the social imperative just mentioned above and embedded in the group collaboration. Working with the ABT individuals are enabled to come together to appraise and improve each other's works in a process where people can voice frank responses. The word here would be, quote, gutting, without inflicting injury or derailing progress with defensiveness. The conclusion that narrative is leadership lingers in the mind, bringing together many moments in the preceding 19 presentations that explicitly or implicitly conveyed exactly that message. She's, again, such a good writer. And let's see, Liz, final statement there.
Oh man, final statement after Jen just nailed it. But you know, I was just thinking, we spent 3 hours on this podcast dissecting this 90-minute of the Narrative Blitz. It was such a great experience, and just reflecting on it, the way everything connected together so well, all the parts, kind of like a systems look at it, all the parts separately were great, but you put them together and you have this fantastic whole. So it was great to be part of it. I enjoyed this whole process of talking about it more and sharing some of the take home. So thank you for doing the podcast to bring it to a wider audience. I'll stop talking now. I see your face.
No problem. and you know, we got about 1.5 minutes left. Rick, final statement, and then Marlis.
Yeah, I'm also excited to be part of this, but I'm even more excited to see where we go next, because this thing has evolved so significantly since we started doing the framework course. It's just been exciting, and the Blitz kind of brought all that together. So I'm anxious to see where we go next.
Excellent. And Marlis, we're going to give you the final word. Put it all into context.
The ABT is really versatile. I think the standardized language Jen just mentioned is a great observation, but it also is a tool, a standardized tool to assess how much somebody understands a topic. And so this is kind of what I use with students to get a feel for how well did they grasp, the problem or the background or the context. So the ABT is very, very powerful in a lot of different ways, I would say.
I think eventually we should do a separate episode on that, the use of the ABT as an assessment tool, exactly what you're talking about. I think we could fill a whole hour discussion on that as well. So that's a perfect thing to finish on. Thank you all very, very much. Once again, next week, we're going to have Peter Sale and Bob Stenick talking about Peter's new book on coral reefs. And Peter spent his whole career doing his most important work on the Great Barrier Reef at Heron Island. So Jen, I'll be I'll get you a PDF of the book and see if you can pull out a few thoughts about that from your Australian perspective. It'll be a fun discussion. So thank you guys very, very much. Thanks everybody, and see you next week. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye everyone.
Bye.